Thank you to all of you for coming out on this gloomy day to talk about a subject that my students think is very dry, wonky, and tends to put them to sleep. But what I would like to do is to take this concept of entitlements and to show you that it's actually a very interesting and exciting topic. So as Glenn said, I'm a political scientist, and we political scientists tend to think of entitlements as budgetary items that have both political and policy consequences. And we've just been through a very divisive and nasty presidential election season, one in which the concept of entitlements figured very prominently in political discussions. And I guarantee you that we are, in the coming months, going to talk about entitlements again as we talk about the deficit and tax reform and the debt ceiling and the state of our economy. Now, at some level, particularly in the policy and academic world, when we talk about entitlements, it can sound rather dry and technical. We're talking about replacement rates and COLAs, the wage base, things that only a wonk like myself would enjoy. But what I would like to do today is to draw attention to another aspect of the term entitlements, and that is their moral dimension, the way that in the real world, in practical politics, the way in which we talk about entitlements and how it's used in this public discourse to talk about the role that government plays in our society and the moral worth of individuals. I like to think of the concept of entitlement as an iceberg, where visible on top is the public discourse, both that dry, technical policy speak and the heated political rhetoric. But underneath the surface is a hidden dialogue about who is entitled and who can legitimately make a claim for government help. And associated with this hidden dialogue is a whole universe of hidden policies and programs that channel aid to some groups and not others. And within this hidden universe and the discourse that surrounds it, it's worth peering underneath that surface, because there we get to see how our nation talks about deservingness. And it's a discourse that cuts to the very heart of racial justice and equal opportunity in the United States. All right, so what does entitlement mean? If I were to take the dictionary and flip it open, I would find not one, but three definitions. First, there's the legal definition. An entitlement is the right to benefits that are specified by law or by contract. Then we've got a policy definition. An entitlement is also the name given to a government program that provides benefits to members of a specified group, or it's the funds that are used to pay for such a program. And then finally, we've got a moral dimension, a moral definition. It's the belief that one is deserving of or entitled to certain privileges. We might also call this a judgmental definition, because when we apply the label of entitled to someone, we're making a judgment about this person's moral character. We make a judgment about whether or not this person's claim to the entitlement is a rightful one, whether this person deserves help. All right. Each of these aspects of entitlement, I'll argue, is a coded way of talking about and thinking about race. So let's take a look. Let's start first with the legal and policy definitions. Now, when we social scientists and policy people talk about entitlements in the legal and policy world, we usually mean programs like Social Security's old age and disability pensions. We mean Medicare and veterans benefits, sometimes even Medicaid. These programs are a contract between the federal government on one hand and some group of citizens on the other. It's a contract that promises benefits if citizens meet certain conditions, such as making payroll contributions during their working life and then reaching old age, or engaging in military service. There's no set of programs in the American welfare state whose recipients are seen as more deserving of benefits than the beneficiaries of these entitlement programs. These programs aren't handouts. They're benefits that citizens have earned by satisfying the conditions that government has asked them to satisfy. Because of this, these entitlement programs have special budgetary status. They are also known as mandatory spending. Now, typically, when Congress is going to spend for a program, it has to first vote for the program, and then it has to appropriate the money. If it doesn't take the vote to appropriate the money, we don't spend money, even if the program exists. Well, that's not the case with entitlements. Because entitlements are a legal contract, government has to pay the benefits that are specified in the statute to the people it's specified to, regardless of whether that money is appropriated or not. Now, how much government's going to spend in each year is determined by that statute, and unless our political leaders go in and they change the statute to reduce payments or restrict eligibility, that money is already predetermined. They can always change the statute, they just don't often do it. Because entitlements have a privileged status in the budgetary debate, they are a growing share of the federal budget. Today, they constitute about half of all government spending. So before Congress makes a single decision at the beginning of the year, half the money that it has collected in taxes is already pledged to something, right? As healthcare costs grow and our population ages, these entitlement programs are going to put pressure on all other spending, including non-entitlement spending for the poor. In an age of fiscal austerity, where we're primarily concerned with keeping a balanced budget, it's very easy to see entitlements as a policy problem, as a roadblock to our goal to a balanced budget. But earlier in our nation's history, and these posters from the golden years of Social Security attest to that, at an early point in our nation's history, they represented something different. They represented opportunity. Social Security was the foundation for the modern social safety net. Prior to the enactment of Social Security, people basically worked until they dropped dead, or they relied on their adult children to take care of them, or they lived in dire poverty as their bodies weakened with old age. Poverty at this time was virtually universal in old age. Well, Social Security changed that. It was a promise to American workers that after a lifetime of labor, they would be able to retire with dignity. But it wasn't just a program for senior citizens, and I think this is something that's important to keep in mind. Social Security also freed young adults to care for their growing children without worrying about the financial well-being of their aged parents. And in the years following World War II, Social Security was just one of the many promises that were made to American workers and their families. And these promises included the right to organize and the right to collectively bargain for wages and benefits. It also included the right to government assistance to buy homes, to attend college, and to start a business. These promises built the modern American middle class as we know it today. Or rather, I should say it built the modern white middle class, because it turns out Social Security wasn't for everybody. Agricultural workers, domestic workers, government workers, they were all excluded from coverage for Social Security. And in segregated post-war America, these were the jobs that African Americans filled. So by excluding these kinds of workers, not only were African Americans excluded from Social Security until the 1950s, they were also left out of the major wealth-building policies enacted in the early and middle part of our century. Because the armed forces were segregated during World War II and the GI Bill was administered locally in a discriminatory fashion, because most colleges that weren't historically black were also blatantly discriminatory, Black Americans in the United States just did not get to experience the same gains in higher education and earning power that white Americans did during this time period. Until fair housing laws were enacted in the late 1960s, Black families could not move to the suburbs to chase better educational opportunities for their children, nor could they grow wealth by investing in homes that were appreciating in value. Instead, they stayed in urban neighborhoods that were depreciating in value, and the wealth that they poured into their homes lost value. Because their parents were ineligible for Social Security for so long, adult children faced the task of providing for their aged parents while they were also trying to raise their families. The sandwich generation phenomenon that we talk about so much today when we're talking about white baby boomers, that has been the enduring condition of Black families for much of the past century. Well, that was then, and this is now. Does that history still matter? We went back and we fixed some of the discriminatory provisions of Social Security. Does it still matter that African Americans were excluded from some of these policies? Yes, it does. It's true that we have an earnings gap between similarly educated Blacks and whites, and it's also true that that earnings gap has shrunk but not disappeared in recent decades. But the real disparity, and one that nobody talks about these days, the real disparity is in wealth accumulation. Last year, in 2012, the net assets, and when I say net assets, I mean if we took everything that a family owned and we subtracted from it what their debts were, the net assets of the average white family exceeded that of the average Black family 27-fold. While the average Black family had net assets of just a little bit over $4,000, the average white family had a net worth of over $115,000. That's a great deal of disparity. And this has profound consequences for equality of opportunity. We live day to day on wages, but we use wealth to create opportunities. We use wealth to pay for college. We use wealth to open businesses, to invest in a home, in a safe neighborhood with a good school. We use wealth to weather the storms like sickness, disablement, spells of unemployment, the storms in life that momentarily set us back and upend very carefully planned lives. So in short, wealth means more opportunities and more security. It means that because we have a wealth disparity, white middle-class men and women are more likely to benefit from gifts and bequests passed down from their parents, money that they can use to buy homes in better neighborhoods, to send their kids to private schools or to college, or to start a retirement or college savings fund. It means that they can leverage greater opportunities than is justified by their take-home pay alone. Family wealth, first and foremost, means that white middle-class parents are able to pass on the privileges of their class status onto their children. These are opportunities that Black families do not enjoy. For Black families, the flow of wealth is likely to occur in two directions, both backwards to aging parents and forwards to growing children. Because of that two-way flow of wealth, working-aged men and women are less able to save for their own retirement, meaning that their children will likely have to support them in their old age. Because wealth allows us to leverage opportunities, the racial disparity in wealth means that even though we have torn down barriers to formal exclusion, the ability of Black parents to pass on their class advantages to their children is still very severely constrained. So, should our nation's leaders do more to create opportunity, to build wealth, to rectify these historic advantages? Yes, but are they likely to? This brings me to my next dimension of entitlements, the moral definition. The belief that one is deserving of or entitled to certain privileges. These days, we are inundated with a slew of pop psychology books that make the case that we're living in an age of entitlement, where children expect to get trophies just for participating, where every student's an A student, girls are princesses, and we're entitled to a good life. Of course, before the Disney princess, the original image of entitlement was the welfare queen. This was a character coined by Ronald Reagan during his run for presidency in 1976. During that campaign, he disparaged a quote-unquote white woman in Chicago that he claimed has 80 names, 30 addresses, 12 Social Security cards. He said she's got Medicaid, she's getting food stamps and welfare under all her different names. And her tax-free cash income alone is over $150,000. She drove a pink Cadillac and she cashed her welfare checks at the liquor store. She was also a rotten mother, by the way. The welfare queen wasn't the poor widow of yesteryear who huddled with her cold and hungry children and was grateful for whatever little charity she got. The welfare queen was dependency with an attitude. She was arrogant about her dependency, ungrateful for what she had, scornful of hard work, and all too willing to cheat the system. Reagan never said that the welfare queen was black, but he didn't have to, because she conformed to a lot of white stereotypes about blacks. Now, in recent years, conservatives have tried to resurrect the welfare queen trope. Many conservative think tanks create indices where they track dependency on government. Since the 1990s, we have basically gutted spending for impoverished families. And in fact, most families who are poor continue to work, but conservative policy analysts tell us there's still a whole lot of dependency out there, and in fact, it's growing. It's at an all-time high right now. If you think back to the presidential campaigns of the fall, there was all sorts of discussions about how 47% of Americans pay no income tax. Roughly half receive some kind of government benefit. A lot of that rhetoric divided the nation into two, between the entitled and the working, between the makers and the takers. So these pictures up here were taken from Tea Party rallies around the nation. There, the rhetoric of entitlement suggests that if only we could just get some people, and I suppose this is the people who don't attend Tea Party rallies, if we just get some people to take some responsibility in their own lives, it would solve a lot of our problems. It takes all the policy problems that we face today in our current economic situation: an aging population, out of control healthcare spending, a slow recovery from the worst recession in 80 years. It takes all of those big structural problems and boils it down to individual action. Those people just need to work harder and stop feeling entitled to hard-earned earnings of other people. The polarization of the debate over the role of government in creating equal opportunity was in full display this last fall, where activists on the right labeled the entitled the takers and saw themselves and other tax-paying, hardworking Americans as the makers. And each side presumably had its own partisan identities and presidential preferences. This discussion about entitlements was also, in fact, is also still infused with racial animosity, much of it directed at our nation's first black president. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. During the primaries this summer, Newt Gingrich derided Obama as the food stamp president. And Rick Santorum accused the president of trying to create an entitlement society in which, quote, the dream of freedom and opportunity has become a nightmare of dependency. These images, too, are also from Tea Party signs, from bumper stickers and posters that are on sale on the internet through a variety of conservative organizations. They are excerpts of television ads run during the fall presidential campaign. And these, I thought, were some of the least offensive that I found. These images conflate both blackness and the person of Barack Obama with liberal elitism, welfare dependency, and anti-Americanism. Indeed, Obama's signature domestic policy achievement, the enactment of the Affordable Care Act, which provides health insurance coverage to working-age Americans, in these posters is derided with a caricature of the president as primitive and foreign, maybe even Soviet with the hammer and sickle, I'm not sure. Other prominent images at Tea Party rallies have cast Obama as Hitler, or suggested that he's paying for the votes of poor non-whites by promising them expanded welfare aid or to illegal immigrants amnesty. So from mandates to purchasing healthcare insurance to the taxes that are collected to pay for a variety of public initiatives, including aid to the poor. For activists on the right, this kind of governmental activism is tantamount to, yes, you guessed it, white slavery. The nation's first black president seeks to enslave white people. It's easy to dismiss Tea Party activists as a bunch of extremists and racists, But before we do so, we should be aware of the extent to which their rhetoric, as inflammatory as it is, reflects broadly held views and misperceptions about entitlements. The feeling is out there, they just put it on the signs for everyone to see. Most Americans, in fact, do not recognize the extent to which we all depend on government assistance. And because we don't recognize that, it's very easy to disparage that other guy. It's true that nearly half of all Americans receive a government benefit, but almost all of these individuals are the elderly, the disabled, or the working poor. However, a significant share of Americans who actually are dependent on government fail to recognize their own entitlement. For instance, according to a 2010 poll by the New York Times, 44% of self-identified Tea Party supporters rely on Medicare, and 48% receive Social Security benefits. How is it that a group that relies so heavily on government entitlements decries entitlements and government spending? Well, in fact, recent behavioral research found that nearly half of all beneficiaries of Social Security and Medicare did not consider those programs, quote unquote, government social programs. Hence, it's very telling that there is a sign that tells government to keep its hands off Medicare, the quintessential government program. Neither do most Americans count tax expenditures as entitlements or as government programs, but they are a form of government spending. These expenditures are the benefits that Americans receive through the tax code whenever they fulfill some program requirement, such as purchasing a home, saving money for college or retirement, donating to charity, or receiving employer-provided health care. But rather than get a check from a visible government agency like the Social Security Administration or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, citizens simply take a deduction from their own taxes and the benefit goes through the Internal Revenue Service. If we counted up tax expenditures, 96% of Americans receive a government benefit. The remaining 4%, who presumably are free because they're not dependent on government, happen to be non-poor children who are too young to qualify for any government program. So they're not dependent on government, they're just dependent on their parents. These tax expenditures disproportionately benefit the most affluent Americans, those Americans who are privileged enough to have employer-provided health care, to own a home, to have the discretionary income to both save and to donate. And yet, because these benefits are channeled through the tax code rather than through a visible government program, nearly 2/3 of the beneficiaries of this kind of spending don't count that deduction as a government benefit. And spending for these kinds of tax expenditure programs is huge. If they were taken all together, they would equal half of all the money that the government receives in tax revenue each year. They are worth more than all of the nation's anti-poverty programs combined. They're huge. Stop for a moment and think about the irony of the situation. African Americans were denied access to the major programs that built wealth and human capital for the white middle class. And today, African Americans and other racial minorities enjoy less wealth than their white counterparts, and they are more vulnerable to unemployment, to poverty, and to economic downturns. Our modern economy is dependent on their cheap labor, which forms the backbone of our low-wage service sector industry. And yet they're accused of lacking a work ethic and feeling entitled. Low-income groups, and this includes low-income racial minorities, are not necessarily more reliant on government programs than the middle and upper class, but the kinds of programs they rely on are different. Food stamps, family assistance, Medicaid, these are direct and visible government spending programs. On the other hand, the programs that benefit white America and the middle class, even if they are larger in terms of the dollars spent or the people enrolled, they are hidden, and thus they don't raise the same specter of dependency and entitlement. Now, we have a host of budgetary and economic challenges that confront us. But rather than talk honestly and seriously about entitlements and government spending, we are instead distracted by a racialized debate over makers and takers and stereotypes about who works and who doesn't and who feels entitled and who doesn't. We need to find more ways to create opportunity in our society. But it's as if we are all too ready to deny the constructive role that government can play in the lives of citizens, the constructive role that it has played in the lives of many citizens in the past, particularly whites. And if we will claim those benefits but deny them to others, then if that's not the essence of privilege and entitlement, then I don't know what is. Thank you.